Okay, let's start. So I'm first going to go over some project ideas, um, which again I know some of you have already spoken with me about other ideas. I didn't include them out here, but these are just some that I've come up with, and it's actually on a link on Google Docs also. So I'm going to keep adding to it and send the pointer around. So um, one, I guess, it's a really a suite of projects. So um, there are a variety of biometric authentication mechanisms which have sort of appeared in both smartphones and also these devices like Google Home and Amazon Echo and things like that. Some of them are based on Apple's Face ID. Some of them are based on voice. Whenever it comes time for uh, some such metric to be used to authenticate, there really are a couple of different dimensions that one must take into account. One is how robust is it to variances that occur in a valid user over time. In case of Face ID, it's something simple like lighting condition, or whether you have your glasses on or not, or like when was your last haircut, stuff like that. In case of voice, again, there are some natural changes. There are kind of rapid changes over sort of longer term. So that's one dimension, and the other is uniqueness, which is sort of over a population or ensemble of user, how well does it work? So I guess kind of the idea out here is to really see how robust these things are and how unique they are. So I guess the one which I'm sort of most interested in really are the voice identification ones. I think there hasn't been uh, they they have been introduced. I mean, many of the Android phones have it, and like I said, Google Home also has it. So it's a project which basically is a evaluation oriented project. You'll have to line up people to kind of subject this thing to, but evaluate it along these dimensions. There's a related one which I didn't list out here, and I would add it to the docket also. So in Android, there is also this mode where now you can disable your password, and essentially it uses or supposedly uses sensory information and other information to kind of figure out whether the phone left you. Okay, so the idea is that as long as the phone is with you and you're carrying it, then somehow it knows that that's the case and doesn't ask you for the password. And then the moment it detects, then it does. Again, there are a couple of possible projects. One is to just stress test that, how well does that mechanism work? And the other alternative is to come up with an equivalent one, which is essentially detecting using sensory data, kind of making a classifier and testing it whether the phone is with you or not, in the sense that was it incorrectly turned on or not. So authentication, I guess, uh, remains one of the challenge in a lot of these devices, because you don't want to burden, and yet um, uh, uh, you also want it to be kind of both robust and sufficiently unique. So, for example, Face ID, um, there have been reported problems with father-son, mother-daughter, sort of twins, those kind of scenarios. So that's a uniqueness issue. And the robustness part, I have one, and when I get up in the morning and I don't have my glasses on and I just pick up the phone, it almost always never recognizes me. So then I type my long password, which kind of defeats the purpose. So I think these things are interesting. Another possible project out here, since I had mentioned that survey kind of things are also potentially okay. So I think a good thorough survey of strengths and weaknesses of and what are the different biometric and sensory based authentication mechanisms that have occurred. I think that's also a possibility. So that's one. The second one is an idea from my postdoc Bharat, which is actually kind of pretty interesting. So we want our apps and devices to be kind of responsible in the sense that behave ethically, legally, things like that. So, for example, if an app is recording something, then it should obey laws and things like that. Now, unfortunately, a lot of regulations, they are specific to um, locale. They vary from state to state, country to country. On my recent visit to India, I noticed in a few places they basically said if I take photo of anyone without their permission, I can be arrested. Okay, it's not something that happens here. You can take photos in public. It may at best be um, considered rude, but it's not against the law. In fact, quite the contrary, the law out here is that in a public space, there is no expectation of privacy, and therefore you are. Or take the notion of recording conversations. It's very different in this country from state to state. California, for example, is what is called as an all-party consent thing. So if I'm recording a conversation, then I have to have permission from everyone engaged, and that applies even to a phone call, whereas many other states are single party consent state. So even if the one person, and that could be the recorder, gives agreement, then things are legal. So it could be, for example, let's say I'm talking with someone in, I don't know, Texas, which I think is a one party consent state, then that person can record the conversation without my permission, but I cannot record the conversation without his or her permission. So the idea out here is that what if we were to create a service, kind of a could be a web service with some local caching component, but the idea is applications can be aware of what the relevant privacy regulations are in a current locale. Seed it with kind of the obvious ones like photography related and conversation related and all, but make the system so that it is more broadly usable also, because it's only a matter of time when other type of sensory data for which currently we need permission only at the level of a device, it may also become contextual in nature. So what all can I capture or not capture? If I um, and context can be very broad also, like for example, let's say I visit a public space, a camera out there may want to know what my privacy wishes are. So you could think of a version where it's not simply about the location, but also about the context. So individuals can advertise their privacy wishes, and then they get aggregated, and then the app can understand that. There has been some work also otherwise on second and third party type privacy things. So like some people have had, like there's a work out of Microsoft where um, they would have a QR code on the clothing, and that would advertise your privacy wishes, or beacons that advertise it. So like my phone may send out a BLE beacon which announces what I'm comfortable with or not, and then the sensors in the space adapt to it. So it's in the same vein that kind of encourage responsible um, uh, sensing. Uh, Third project, um, IoT traffic aware network firewalls. So we all use firewalls, sometimes explicitly, knowingly, sometimes they're just built into your routers and all. A lot of the time they are some proprietary thing, but usually these are some Linux distributions. And in Linux, there is a very nice capability called IP tables, but basically it's a framework at the operating system level where you can attach rules saying under what condition can a packet going out or in should be let through or stopped, or what other actions. It's kind of a match and action kind of framework that exists. But normally that network firewalls which are considered, they're basically considered based upon these kind of ingress egress rules only. But firewalls or gateways, home gateways, are particularly uniquely situated to also detect various kind of things. So let's say, for example, one fine day, my smart lock begins to talk to some unusual server in China. I may not realize it, but my gateway does. And at the very least, it can detect that deviation from abnormal behavior and then inform me. Or let's say at another time, suddenly, I don't know, my thermostat begins to talk to that lock. Again, there is something fishy going on. So, gateway, and I guess more generally, network infrastructure is able to kind of learn about what is normal, what is abnormal, and abnormal may mean who it is talking to, at what time it is talking with, or even traffic patterns, like suddenly a device becomes very chatty. All those kind of things can come into play. So detecting such traffic to see a potential compromise, and then also restrict, take some action like restrict, notify, doing so automatically. So the idea out here would be to start with one of the firewall distributions for Linux. There are a small number of them, and then add a kind of a observation, learning, anomaly detection kind of a module to it, and then based upon that, change the firewall rules. Um, you could do it at your home. I would be fine deploying it at my home, whatever sort of you're comfortable with. You do need some degree of comfort with working with system software on Linux, but otherwise it's mostly application level. If any questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt. Okay, so that's third one. Fourth one, kind of the same vein, and the idea out here is that there are plenty of networks within the home which through which devices talk to each other, and in particular things which are being used for these IoT devices. So when I kind of think about my own home, I have at least 4 different wireless networks active, and actually I'm missing Bluetooth, so that's 5. So one is the wireless network used by my security system. These are usually, I think, they are like uh, 400, 500 kilohertz frequency band. They are digital sensors, but they're kind of pretty simple stuff, and they basically talk to um, kind of the home security system. So these are whatever motion sensors and door sensors and all. Then I have certain Wi-Fi type devices. Some of them are switches, some of them are sensors. I have a bunch of these smart LED lights, Philips Hue and stuff like that. And they use Zigbee, which is kind of a short range mesh networking standard. And then Z-Wave, which is another competing thing, kind of more of a proprietary de facto standard, which is quite commonly used in switches and stuff like that. So I have these, and then I also have Bluetooth, as I mentioned. So like my smart lock on my front door is Bluetooth enabled, so talks to my phone as well as talks to a Bluetooth to Wi-Fi bridge. So there are all this stuff, and kind of the idea out here is that this traffic can be easily sniffed. Much of it is in 2.4 gigahertz band. Some of it, like I said, security system stuff in 500, 600. Some of it occasionally in the 5 gigahertz band. But luckily, comfortably, there are cheap software-defined radios available now which can monitor and transmit and kind of look at the spectrum from DC through 6 gigahertz. So the idea would be to create a sniffer or perhaps network of sniffers. So kind of imagine an adversary kind of deploying a few of these things outside the property but around the property, and then fusing this information. And there are a variety of inferences about what's going on inside can be done potentially. Occupancy, occupants, like a particular occupant, activities they are engaged in and stuff like that could all be done. So that's in this case. So there are some good SDRs out there at this stage. The grand sort of old one is this thing called USRP, Universal Software Radio Peripheral, but it's now sold by National Instruments. But there are a bunch of others also which have come out, including something called Hack RF1, which seems to be pretty good. Kiwi SDR, Lime SDR. There are a bunch of them out there. Some of them are transmit only, so which are useless for this project, but because, sorry, some of them are listen only, and some of them are listen and transmit both. So anyway, that's another project idea. In some cases, for sniffing some of these things, you could even use the radio of the same type, right? I mean, you could, for Zigbee, I've seen stuff where they just use these eval boards from Atmel or whatnot as kind of sniffers. So that's another possibility. Let's see. Yeah, this one is a subset of the firewalls. I'm going to skip this. Adversarial audio attacks. So I mentioned last lecture this kind of work which attempts to fool machine learning systems, both for image and acoustics. So kind of the idea being that I try to fool, let's say, Amazon Echo, Alexa, in that to obey a command which a human can either not listen or listens differently. So there are both kind of systems that have emerged. Well, there are several variants, as I pointed out last time. Some try to hide the adversarial command and in kind of music or something. So there might be like loud music playing in an advertisement, and then there is somehow buried in it is this other signal. There are others where to the human it might seem like static or some noise, but there is actually some command in it. Or ones which are outside the hearing band of humans. So this is work which has exploited the fact that regular microphones are sensitive to pretty high frequencies, and they make use of some non-linearities that occur in microphones. And then finally, the work which I mentioned my student has been doing, and there are a few other groups, Facebook, Berkeley, they have all published lately, and where the idea is that the human hears one way and the machine interprets the other way. Now, a dirty little secret of all these work is that the attacks thus far, by and large, particularly for the last category, have been at the digital level. What I mean by that is that they have shown that they can have a digitized file which, when fed to machine learning system, causes it to act one way, and the same digitized file, when heard by a human, is heard differently. But that's not how system works. I mean, presumably the attack model is my television may be blaring an ad. That ad goes over the physical channel, hits the microphone, gets digitized, then is being fed to the machine learning system. So you have this speaker to microphone channel, which can be pretty tricky. Now, there is one piece of work which has addressed this, and this is the work out of Berkeley that I mentioned, but they had done it in context of where the human hears it at noise. But the challenge is that how do you train your, how do you learn the characteristics of this thing? So they basically involve a human in a loop kind of approach. The thought I have out here is, what if we were to create a physics-based model of speaker to microphone? That's one possibility. Or what if we separately learn using, let's say, a recurrent neural network, some kind of sequence in, which is kind of at the speaker end, and sequence out, which is at the out on the circuit side of the microphone, and we kind of learn a model of that, and then we use that model together with the existing techniques. So there are two types of techniques out there. One, which to decide how the input should look like, they essentially assume rest of the system, the neural network, is a differentiable network. And so essentially what they're doing is, I want to modify the result in a certain adversarial direction, like wrong result, and then they back propagate and decide how should I perturb the input, and they play that game. And the others are which don't require this differentiability. That's my students' approach, but they use genetic algorithms, essentially, which are a form of an optimization technique, but they're called gradient-free methods. So I guess the idea is either a physics-based model or a neural network type model which has learned the channel behavior and then combine it with these existing techniques to see whether we can create attacks which can work at a physical level, truly. That is, we can transmit from a speaker and then they work. And so the human is really hearing as opposed to that separate digital file. Trusted sensing. So this is kind of this broad category of work where the idea is that lots of places we have situations where I'm getting a reading, a sensor reading from some sensor, but how do I know that I can trust it? And there are sort of typically a sensor reading would have three different things. Generically, the value, the time, and the location, and all of those things are important and perhaps even individually so. So some ideas have floated around in the literature on how can a sensor provide proof that it indeed did this. So for example, that I indeed took this sample at the time I said and not pretended that at a later stage I had it. So you could imagine I can make use of my neighbors. I can provide them with some sort of a value computed over my measurement, and that becomes the proof because the idea is that I'm not in collusion with my neighbor. So in a network kind of a setting, you could do that. You could also make use of TPM or SGX or these kind of trusted hardware entities, because the idea is that these hardware entities have an independent trust with the manufacturer. So again, at the time of capture, I can get at least some part of my measurement tuple sort of attested, kind of like proof of milling, and then that becomes the proof. So the goal out here would be to, on some embedded platform, let's say BeagleBone Black or Raspberry Pi or something, create a trusted sensing stack so that when we publish a result onto some suitable web cloud service for sensor data storage, we are also supplying kind of a proof that indeed the measurement is correct. Now, the value part is tricky, but I think timestamp can certainly be done because time is maintained at the system level. And I think location can also be doable because assuming there is some sort of a GPS type device which can be independently attested by both the application and by the operating system. So you'll have to assume that there is some sort of a trusted computing base on your device. So there's some background work that kind of exists. Basically, it's a paper and an associated patent, and I'm sure there's some other stuff as well if you dig around. There is a closely related sort of project idea, simply attested timestamps. So the idea out here is that in many cases, but particularly like financial transactions and all, there's a legal requirement that things be timestamped. But how do we know that the timestamp was actually done at the time it was, right? In the sense, how do we trust the timestamp? So it's sort of closely related. In this case, we are saying that a transaction indeed happened at the timestamp it did, and can there be an independent proof of it? So like, for example, let's say I did in a very volatile stock market, let's say I issue a sell order to Fidelity, and Fidelity claims I didn't, and I say I did, then how do we reconcile this thing? So could we have a trusted timestamping kind of a situation? There's some other project ideas in this broadly trusted sensing thing you could look at. What if sensors are attacked? So I had mentioned this, one of the slides, that Waze being attacked by these researchers in Israel by using Android emulators running on servers and kind of mimicking as devices. So very generally, there are two types of attacks you can imagine in a crowdsourced sensing system. Waze is one, but you can imagine a whole bunch of other types of systems. One is that someone injects a malicious sensor reading. so incorrect sensor reading, and the other is that these kind of ghost or what's called as Sybil attacks. Um, could I reach a robust inference in the presence of such attacks? Okay, that's kind of, and this is what I had mentioned last time as the secure estimation or secure state estimation problem. So looking at that in context of some application, I think Waze is a good application, but there could be others where some crowdsourcing kind of thing that you could explore. Side channels and embedded platforms. Again, this is a potentially a sort of bunch of different projects which I've rolled into a single slide. Embedded platforms have many side channels through which the internal state of the software can be revealed. Power consumption, so these devices are deployed out in the open. You can imagine an adversary tapping onto the power line or something and learning about it. Voltage fluctuation, whenever circuits operate, depending upon their activity, the voltage line sees certain noise. So like in digital circuits, when lots of gates switch, that injects what is called as a LDI over DT noise, which is basically change in voltage translating into current draw change, and that in turn resulting in a voltage fluctuation on the line. EMI, electromagnetic interference, this is merely the fact that the chip is running. If it is, many chips nowadays change their clock frequency, they power manage, they shut down, stuff like that. All of these things result in a different emission characteristic of the RF electromagnetics in the electromagnetic spectrum. There are other side channels. There are timing related things. So like, for example, you may be able to monitor the spectrum activity. While the packets may be encrypted, you certainly see when they are being sent out, a little bit like my earlier attack example. So there are all these sort of side channels out there. They can be used for good or bad. So the bad one obviously is that adversary can use it to learn the internal state. So back in 90s, one of the dominant encryption standard at the time, called DES or DES3, I think, was broken because it turned out that depending upon whether the key had at a particular location had a bit 0 or 1, the for loop took different amount of time. And so if you looked at the power profile, sort of low power consumption and then a high power consumption, and the high power consumption duration depended upon 1 or 0. So by monitoring the power consumption, we could basically figure out what the key patterns were. And there have been other examples as well. There is some work out of Georgia Tech a couple of years ago where they showed that they could distinguish between different types of instruction classes on a i86 processor by monitoring the EMI. So there are a bunch of examples like these. For simple processors, which have very few registers and all, maybe you can even tell something about the data. This can also be used by the defender. The idea is that with embedded platforms, we cannot really trust the software because oftentimes there's no OS application isolation. So I cannot have a checker running as part of my code, because if the malware has compromised the code, then probably everything is untrusted from that point on. So the idea then is we need some way of monitoring these systems without having to trust the software itself. So we could do it by monitoring from outside. And so now it's the good side. I'm looking at my own platform and I have a good signature for it, and then under an attack situation, I can sort of protect it. So projects here, I think of particular interest to me is EMI, but I think there are cool things to be done in almost all of these, including power consumption, which is probably the most well understood out there, but just replicating and all and kind of figuring out would be interesting. One of the things that could be explored is, what if I know the code? So both as an adversary, I may know what the code is running on the system, because maybe I know that you are using this open source software package like that, and as a defender, I certainly do. So by looking at this, could I create a more generic framework where I give you a program, an application program, let's say it's kind of some sort of for loop or something, and and basically by analyzing the program and knowledge of uh, the processor characteristics, could you now say how vulnerable a particular variable is to leakage? Okay, like for example, um, this is more leaky because it has a stronger imprint on the power profile, let's say, than some other variable. So interesting set of ideas, and again, if you Google, you'll sort of find some papers and all. Privacy-aware sensor trace synthesis, I'm going to talk a little bit about in today's lecture, but um, very generically, we face this problem that whenever devices, smartphones, etc., collect sensory data, then from that data you can make a variety of different kind of inferences, some of which you did intend to share when you're sharing the sensor data, and others you didn't. So one framework to think about it is that there are some desirable inferences that I'm comfortable with, so you can think of it as your whitelist, and then there are others, undesirable ones, which are kind of the blacklist. And I have to share the sensor data, so how could I go around making sure that whatever I'm sharing, my recipient can decipher the whitelist but not the blacklist? And of course, one answer to this thing is just compute the whitelist and share that. That is certainly works, but it's not entirely fully safe still. Just bear in mind, because the whitelist and blacklist may still have some mutual information. Other possibilities are that I somehow censor the data or add noise to it or stuff like that. But another class of techniques is to synthesize the data. So the idea is I don't share the data that I actually collected, but I use that to learn a model and then share the model. Okay, and the idea is that the recipient can run that model and generate a synthetic data trace which would have the right type of characteristics. So there are potentially a variety of generative models that exist, but one type which has gained a lot of attention in deep learning literature in recent times are the so-called adversarial learning models. And kind of the idea in adversarial training is that the generative model would try to generate a sample saying this is a valid sample from the population, and there is kind of a critic, there's kind of like a adversary, and what the adversary does is it tries to say, aha, can I distinguish whether it is from population or not? So the adversary they are essentially engaged in a game. I will say, I have learned how to generate, here is a sample, and you will say, no, I can detect with high accuracy that this is not from the population, and we kind of engage until we both kind of converge. Now, that has been done for a pure generative thing. Kind of the idea here is that you can now think of, there are a bunch of adversaries, some are for whitelisted inferences, some are for blacklisted inferences, and you're trying to find a equilibrium between them, okay, kind of a privacy utility balance. So a good starting point would be my student Mustafa's work or some other similar piece of work. There has been some other work. There's one paper we read in my lab's group meeting last quarter out of MIT, where they use this kind of a model of multiple adversaries, but for a different purpose, where the goal there was that could I learn a model which is not learning about, which is independent of a particular deployment scenario, like a particular home or a particular person. So there again, they had two adversaries. One adversary was trying to make sure that I learned how to make the desired inference well. And another adversary was trying to say, aha, can I decipher whose sensor input it was? So there is some work out there, and kind of the idea here would be to maybe use Mustafa's work as a starting point and introduce this blacklist, whitelist. The goal would be that the sensor trace that you are that you're synthesizing would be one which is preserving the statistics of the whitelisted inferences, but is confusing the recipient about the blacklisted one. This one is from my student Amr to create a testbed network for attacks on vehicles or on networks inside the vehicles. So this is more of a experimental system work. That is, we want to create a test bed which mimics the interior of a vehicle or network with its ECUs, which are the microcontrollers and sensors and control algorithms, and so that then we can in effect emulate the function of a car or the internal control of a car, and then apply study attacks and protection. So this is more of a testbed development kind of thing. And then finally, I guess there is a class of projects which fall into the category where you either replicate or demonstrate some interesting attacks. Security field is littered with this kind of work, which is people try to find vulnerabilities in existing systems, and it can be actually a pretty fascinating, interesting exercise. So pick something, some new toy gadget, and see what the vulnerabilities are by a combination of software and hardware probing in there. So that's my current list. Hopefully it gives some ideas, but by no means you're obligated to whatever you're supposed to come up with your own ideas. So some groups have spoken with me, but please do talk in the coming days. And if you want to pursue any one of these that I have listed, then again, come and chat with me. Okay. Any questions? Okay, cool. So what I also want to quickly do is to get a sense of who's actually in the class. Could you do this attendance thing? So just take a photo. It's again meant strictly for me to get a sense of how many people are in the class. Are you still looking for a PTE? You are. Okay. So why don't you use the one which I already gave? No, now you can use it. I mean, it was never yanked. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I will. Yeah, I was preparing it just before the class, so I didn't get the time. Yeah. I will. And if I don't, please just ping me on Piazza. And also, my students are a great resource for project ideas. Just I think the ones who are working, who have interest in security and or privacy. Amr, who is unfortunately stuck in Egypt because of he made the mistake of telling the U.S. embassy that he works in security and privacy, and of course, now they want to do an FBI check on him. So, but anyway, hopefully he'll be back in 2-3 weeks. Um, uh, but he can remotely kind of advise. One lesson for those of you who are international students: if you go back, don't say you're working in security. Um, um, and also my student Mustafa, he's into privacy aspects quite a bit. So he's another good person. And then Fatima, some of the project ideas are from her. So these are kind of 3 students. You can go chat with them. And of course, any other source of project inspiration is fine. Okay, can I move on to the main lecture? Anyone still waiting to go? Okay. Okay, so I guess leading up to this point, I had covered all the I covered kind of the security ramification, security kind of things, and I guess this was the very last slide. I kind of walked through the history of some CPS-ish security incidents which are there. I want to spend some time on kind of again a very high-level view of privacy issues also. So I guess much of the privacy issues in IoT fall into the category that these devices sense what is happening in the world around us. Okay, they're either sensing us or sensing our spaces or sensing other people in the spaces. So this is a quote from some article, which is that kind of this it's a virtual real-time biography of our most personal activities, and in many ways, it's very, very true. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of inferences, some of them potentially harmful, some of them merely embarrassing, and often one which you may not explicitly have thought that they would be revealable. So almost every conference in embedded system sensing nowadays, there are always 2, 3 papers which fall into the category my whatever smartwatch or smartphone or whatever can do this, and then they show that using some sensory data and using some machine learning algorithm and perhaps some side information, they are able to make some interesting inference, which was unexpected. And I guess the problem in part is also compounded by that there's usually very little control that the end users have or visibility that the end users have into what is going on. So for the longest while, the sensory information in our smartphones was pretty liberally shared with the apps. It's only in recent years that you have begun to see things like accelerometer data and all have we began to have controls over it. And also, for the longest while, they were kind of like binary, as in uh, if you don't agree to share it, app doesn't get installed. And in fact, much of it is still true. Most apps are very brittle in the sense that even if they don't need a sensory information, if you deny it to them, they basically their functionality goes totally berserk. There's also no really no notion of controlling the quality. So hopefully quality affects the degree to which an app can know about a particular inference, but you don't have control over it. So for example, I need Uber to come and pick me up precisely where I am, but maybe I want Facebook to only have a general sense of my location so that it can throw the right ad at me. Um, but yet both of them get location at the same level. Bluetooth sensors actually are pretty, and external sensors more broadly are pretty open in the way they share the data because they're not bound to any specific applications. They're bound to OS, and then kind of there's pretty liberal sharing between which app can listen to which sensor. And then, of course, there is malware. And again, there are plenty of examples in the literature where covert channels can be exploited. So even though nominally they are isolated, but they can still sort of communicate somehow. So we'll hopefully read one or two some paper on that topic later. So and that's for mobile devices. I think with your home IoT devices and all, things are even less visible to us. So plenty of examples of kind of things that can be inferred. Smart meter data has been a good sort of candidate for privacy advocates to kind of point out the kind of things that can be inferred from it. But the basic notion is that your home's electricity usage kind of carries all sort of signatures which tell what kind of appliances you're using, who's there, a whole bunch of inferences which are doable because many appliances have very distinctive characteristics. And actually, at the meter level, you have a lot more detailed information because you have information about voltage, current, phases, and from that you can also get sort of whole bunch of more. If you sample at a high level, you can know even more stuff. So, for example, a lot of devices that we use so-called switching power supplies. Anyone knows what that is? Switch mode power supplies. How do they work?
So, yeah, they have their like two types, the boost and the thing. So how they work is I'm not sure how they work, but the purpose of using them is to provide a constant voltage supply. Like
They provide a constant voltage, but internally there's something very interesting about them. Anyone? Yeah. So what's switching mode? So normally power regulators are so-called linear power regulators. They're kind of amplifiers, okay? But the way switching mode power supply work is they what is called as chop the signal. So they take the incoming signal and they sample it at a very high frequency. And so essentially, um, uh, the idea is that by controlling the, well, let me back up. So think of it the following way, that to supply high power to something, one and high and stable power to one, to a load, one thing is I can take my kind of uh, unregulated sort of incoming signal and directly through a series of linear operations kind of generate something which is stable with some sort of a control loop to keep output stable. What switching mode power supplies do is they use kind of a H-bridge structure. They kind of use a bunch of switches, and the idea is switches are controlled by a square waveform whose whose duty cycle indicates what fraction of time those switches are on, and and the energy to those switches or the current to those switches are supplied by my um, uh, by the main power signal that we have. So by precisely controlling the duty cycle of the waveform, which is controlling the switch, I control the voltage that I'm seeing at the output. But to do all of this, we are sampling at this high rate, which is like tens of kilohertz. And all of that noise leaks into the power line. So if you monitor at a higher frequency spectrum, the AC lines, you would see signatures of all these kind of power supplies. And they are actually a giveaway. Dell may use something different than Apple. And so you can begin to identify things. And in fact, each one of these also has unique, like 2 Apple adapters will have tiny variations. So you can even kind of fingerprint them at that level. So there's tons of information out there which can be leaked. Some more dramatic examples of this, and so this was early work out of Germany, where they showed they can see which movie you are watching on your television by monitoring the smart meter data, and kind of the concept was that the televisions tend to be very distinctive power loads, so I can clearly kind of identify them, and then the specific signature that they have is driven by obviously how much power they're consuming, and how much power they are consuming is dominated by the screen, the LCD screen or the OLED screen, and the content on the screen affects the the power taken by the screen is affected by the content, and the reason that happens is because of power optimization. So backlights are often organized as, so in LCD displays, backlights are organized as groups of LEDs at the back of the screen, and then not everything, the entire backlight is not on. If based upon content analysis, if the TV realizes a particular area of the screen is black, then it will turn off the backlight there. And in case of OLED displays, those LEDs never come on. So the upshot is that there is a mapping between the content and the energy consumption that you see. And by analyzing that and comparing it against known signatures of known content, you can basically decipher what content it is, okay? And while you may not be able to do it for a single frame or even a short sequence, but when you start looking over longer video sequences, kind of the pattern begins to emerge. Isn't it?
The smart meter, how do they classify the objects? Like, because the pattern as well as the power consumption will add on with respect to the gadgets that they turn on, right?
Right. So kind of idea is that if firstly, if something is dominating, then you can think of the lower load as kind of just noise, right? The other is that, let's say so happens my dryer is running at the same time as my television, but I may have seen the dryer in isolation at some point, so I can subtract it out. Okay. So variants of this thing have been. Question?
So would this require that you have a reported like every movie?
Yeah, yeah, it does. So you need to have a need to have that side knowledge. Now, depending upon what kind of attack you're mounting out here, if you're limiting it to what live television, then you know what is currently coming, and you can have just a bunch of whatever, let's say a few hundred TV tuners and kind of work with those. But even otherwise, I mean, you can you'll have to sort of create this kind of a fingerprint for, I don't know, every YouTube video and Netflix movie and whatnot out there. Yeah. So that's the. So it's a little bit like the way Shazam works for music, right? I mean, it's kind of the same concept out here, except you're looking at the power trace. Um, this is another example. This is 5 6 year old kind of work, but so the phone looks very old, as you can see. But kind of basic concept is that virtual keyboards, when we type on it, since the phones also have accelerometers, so the way we tap creates a different signature on the accelerometer, and therefore begins to give away something about the location where we tapped, and then that coupled with, let's say, information about frequency of letters and the keyboard layout and all, you can begin to decipher what is being typed or password or things like that. So yeah, plenty of work along this line. That actually reminds me, a potential project space is to look at what smartwatch can reveal about your typing behavior. Okay, perhaps keyboard typing, perhaps phone usage, in terms of what is being done. There is one piece of work out of Illinois which has shown some promising results, but I think it's a good one. It could even be applied to, I don't know, like when I open the key on my door keypad, stuff like that, those kind of things, can they be inferred from this motion? Um, it could be either kind of a purely data driven approach, or better yet, you kind of do a little bit of analysis on how sort of hand is positioned and what the force vectors might look like. People have also exploited inertial sensors, accelerometers, and gyroscopes in other cases also. So these inertial sensors deep down are based upon microelectromechanical structures, where essentially there is some sort of a mass suspended through some silicon structure, and then when there is acceleration or angular velocity, that mass moves, and then you causes some electrical variable to change, and then that's what you are measuring. But essentially, any type of force is going that can move that mass is also going to induce a signature, and in particular, air pressure waves, namely sound, can also impact that. So what you see is that there are very sort of both gyroscope and accelerometer um, demonstrate at least some patterns when sound waves are impingent on it. So these are a couple of examples. I forgot what kind of particular signature, particular sound waveform they are being subjected to, but you do see that there are some very specific patterns that are emerging in the presence of sound. So it's not just simple random noise. So these are kind of, sorry. These are not simply these are otherwise sitting on a table or something like that, so you would just expect kind of this, some stationary signal. So while it is not good to reconstruct, but just remember, even with microphone, our goal is rarely to reconstruct. Sometimes we do want to record, but in a lot of systems, we want to infer something, right? We want to transcribe to text. We want to recognize whose voice it is, identify the person, those kind of things. So what this group out of Stanford showed is that using machine learning algorithms of various categories, they can do things like engine identification and speaker identification and stuff like that. There, and so they created this gyrophone example, which is like that. So main thing out here is that um, that while the quality of the signal is not good to reconstruct, it is good enough to make many inferences. Okay, I'm going to skip some slides. They're just numbers on how well they do. One way people have used this thing, and while the data I have is from Stanford, but there's subsequent work out of UC Davis. So what they showed was that, you know how our phones and all have this thing, like I can say whatever, hey Siri or whatever, hey Google or stuff like that. So these are the keywords, right? Um, so uh, normally they are done by keeping the microphone on and then having some sort of a low power dedicated chip just for a keyword detection. It turns out that accelerometers are much lower power consuming, and you could use them for keyword detection. Okay, so they excel in kind of word level detection. So this thing just shows isolated word recognition, but the Davis work specifically focused on how well does it do for, like, let's say, a specific keyword, for example. And I guess you can then couple it with speaker identification. So anyway, it's kind of a poor man's microphone, but one which can work reasonably well for making specific inferences. Another thing you can do with sensors is fingerprinting. So remember I mentioned earlier that concept of, in the projects, concept of trusted sensing. Can I know that this thing came from this particular sensor? So there's a rich history of work where people have exploited the fact that the noise in the sensor measurement is often very unique to a particular sensor. So like, for example, if you take an image and you look at the noise in the image, the pixel level noise, that's very unique to the specific image sensor in your camera. So likewise, things like accelerometers and all, again, same story, which is they have manufacturing variations which kind of leave a fingerprint out there. So same group at Stanford showed that microphones and all carry that fingerprint, and therefore when you share a sound sample, for example, let's say it's crowdsourced sensing, and I'm sort of collecting sound and submitting it to some public database, you can actually tell which phone it came from. Okay, so that's the kind of a privacy risk that you carry. This work actually was by a couple of students from my group, and it shows kind of just like the television work, the value of side information. So side information is any information which you are getting not from the sensor measurement, but which you are getting from already available knowledge, public databases or whatever you may have access to. So in this case, kind of the idea was the following, and this is an attack which you can do on all phones even today, which is barometer data is almost always unprotected. I don't know about in iOS right now, but it was certainly openly accessible, and on Android devices it is openly accessible, which basically means that an application doesn't need permission to access that. Now, the intent behind barometer is kind of partly to tell height and partly to tell weather condition, like low pressure, high pressure, and that can predict something about the weather. But the height one is interesting. So these barometers are not that useful when it comes to absolute height, but they are actually pretty sensitive to changes in height. So you can tell I went up 2 stories or stuff like that. So those kind of things you can do pretty well. So by looking at the variations in barometer, you essentially are getting a profile, how things are changing. right? The height, elevation above sea level. And you can then combine it with altitude information from public map information and kind of do a fitting. So I give you a trace of variation in height, and then I can go around and look where does such a variation occur. Now, of course, if you are living in whatever flat land, then of course this won't work. But if you're living in a topographically rich area, then there would be elevation changes, and then you can match them against information you get from mapping sources, and then identify where you are. And you can narrow down the search by, like, your IP address perhaps tells me which city you are in or something like that. Perhaps other contextual information helps narrows it. So it's not like you're searching all over the world, but kind of a given locale. So that's kind of the idea out here, that you're comparing against a map. The point, I guess, it's not so much just these specific attacks, but one takeaway, if you take away one key message about privacy is never just about the specific sensor data. It is about that sensor data together with the site information. And in fact, a strong, and one would say the only reasonable definition of privacy is where you do not place any limit on what the adversary knows. Or if you do place a limit, then you really should have a good rationale for that. So, for example, adversary may have a better model on how sensor data predicts a particular disease, for example, right? So just because you don't know doesn't mean adversary. So adversary may have better data, better model, better computation, and access to these kind of databases. So none of those you can preclude. There is no adversary who kind of lives in a cocoon and is trying to attack you just based upon your sensor data just from you. So just something worth it. Another example of a side channel attack of a similar flavor, again, the group at Stanford. So the way this one works is the following. Battery power is the level of the battery, so like 88%, 59%, those kind of things. That's essentially a sensor of the battery level. And that information is open on all these platforms. No application needs permission to get access to it. The rate of change of battery level tells you the power. And the dominant power consumption besides the screen is cellular radio. That's the dominating power consumption. And power consumption of radios depends on the distance to the base station, because if the base station is far away, you're going to transmit more with a higher power. So one could therefore say that the rate of change of the battery signal tells me something about the way my distance to the cellular tower is changing. And location of cellular tower is public information. So therefore, I can begin to now, much like the barometer work, I can begin to fit it to known location. And then if I know some other stuff, like, I don't know, like you are moving on a road, accelerometer data or something like that, I can begin to fit it into a map and sort of localize you very precisely. So these guys showed that they could localize things down to like specific highways and all very easily. So that's another example. So in all of these, the thing that you're seeing is that, yes, firstly, I guess some takeaways. One is the site information, which I kind of already pointed out. The other is that sensors are pretty multidimensional. They pick up information about a lot of things. And one way that sort of people kind of say it is that there are very rich couplings in complex systems. Every sensor at some level picks information about variety of components of the overall state. It's not like accelerometer is not simply measuring acceleration. It's being affected by a whole bunch of things that are going on in the system. So rich couplings together with side information are a big part of our problem. I already pointed out that the permissions to access these sensors are often rather liberal. And even if they are not, there is also a permission fatigue which kicks in, which is if there are too many controls, then users don't use them. So then they also become ineffective. The risks are poorly understood. So what I mean by that is that if an app tells an average person that it is going to make use of gyroscope or barometer, the thought won't come to that person's mind that, aha, it can hear what I am saying or infer my gender or find my location, because the connection is kind of rather loose. And then finally, sensor data is shared pretty liberally, in the sense across apps, across services, and stuff like that. So all of these things collectively kind of do enable, do carry implications for privacy. So let's do the following. It's 5:05. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will restart. Meanwhile, if any of you have questions, Okay, let's start. Okay, so um, want to talk a little bit about kind of the approaches that have emerged. So we kind of looked into um, the risk side of the story. Um, so um, I guess maybe a little bit more on this issue that sensor data is shared, and I think many interesting services have emerged where it's inevitable that either raw sensor data or something derived from it goes out. Uh, there's a class of applications which very broadly fall into the category where we collect data from a population of users in order to make an inference about the population or about our world, city, whatever. So public health applications are like that. Other applications like, for example, as Caltech runs this thing where using your accelerometers on your cell phone, it's kind of like a El Cheapo early warning system for earthquakes. So if while obviously the accelerometer signal from any given phone is kind of noisy, when at the same time a whole bunch of phone kind of sees the same thing, there's some earthquake event happening, and kind of the idea is then they can localize what's going on in time and space. Road conditions, these are all kind of examples, and I guess all of, or ways for traffic, all of these are examples of sensor data being used in a crowdsourced fashion. And it kind of pretty much the way these services are constructed is that they suck the data into some sort of a cloud service, and then you make use of some population scale computation. Sometimes the goal is to learn a model. Sometimes the goal is to take this data, feed it into a model, and take the inference. Um, so, needless to say, the implication out here is that these services would tell you we are not collecting any personal data or personal identifiers, but they still have an identifier. And again, with side information, that identifier is always decipherable. So, for example, let's say I will tell you, share your location with me, but I'm going to only, don't need your name and all, but I just need a unique ID, which you can select. Random ID, you select, you always send the data with the same thing. Would you be comfortable doing it? Like, do you think I can infer you, your identity? Right, yeah, I mean, it's even if you make it sparse, even if you say, even if I were to say, okay, I will only take the data every, let's say, half an hour from you, every hour from you. Even then, over time, pattern will emerge, perhaps converging into a few frequent places in your life, your home, your work, and then there's plenty of side information to begin to uh, decipher from that um, what the identity is. Um, a few times I have engaged in this kind of obnoxious exercise, but I like to have fun on privacy issues. So I fly United a lot. Anyone of you have flown United? You see this screen that they have at the gate area where they show the upgrade list and the standby list, right? And they give you the seat number and they give you the last three digits of, sorry, last three letters of the name, and followed by the first initial. So like my name appears as M. Shri. Um, and then of course in the plane you get to learn some more, the gender, the race, the rough age, um, all of that. I have been able to decipher the identity of the individual by then a little bit of Facebooking and Googling very easily. Sufficient information collectively, right? I mean, I've seen the person, plenty of, okay. So these tidbits actually add up quite rapidly. So there's a researcher at Microsoft uh, John Crum is his name. He has published a series of papers showing that how uh, you can stitch these information together to kind of de-anonymize very rapidly. There are plenty of other examples. Some years ago, there was, I think Netflix had released this database of movie recommendations, and they were very rapidly able to de-anonymize some of the contributors to that also, just from the movie ratings. Stuff like that. AOL was another similar breach. So de-anonymization but by making use of additional information is actually a pretty powerful vehicle. So these systems are risky. People have shown that Waze is pretty easy to de-anonymize specific contributors. Another one which is, I think, just beginning to happen also is these individualized services. So here kind of the excuse is that you are behind a crowd. We don't need your identity, and whatever we will release is going to be only in aggregate form. That's the language you hear often, but it's shown to be risky. These are one-to-one services. If you read the agreement that Nest, which is this part of Google, which does home automation, home security, and stuff like that, makes you sign, they essentially say, we are collecting raw sensor data, you can't do anything about it, you're giving us full rights. That's kind of an upshot of what they make you do. So at the end of the day, there are basically two services they are providing, 2 or 3 services they provide. One is to control the thermostat, another is to warn you that there is fire or smoke at your home, and the third one is to warn you that there is some motion or person or whatever at your home. So a couple of them are inferencing tasks, one of them is a control task. But the way they work is they actually take the raw unencrypted data all the way to their data centers, and they do control, and then they send the result back or a notification back. And leaving aside the fact that they make you sign the rights away to this data, there is no particular, the technical question is, could they have achieved the same thing without the kind of getting to look at the unencrypted data? So again, one possibility is that you just do the computation locally, but usually that runs into the issue that oftentimes we do not have enough computing power. Even if you do have computing power, there's a valid management argument. It's very hard for maintaining millions of complicated devices versus maintaining millions of very simple devices and keeping the complexity in the data center. And then there is also potentially intellectual property type issue also, which is if they were to put their control algorithms out into the device, then they open themselves up to competitors doing reverse engineering and learning about it. So variety of valid reasons you might argue also. But stepping back, I think what these things are pointing to is that the problem of privacy that you often face in IoT kind of settings is a little bit different than what normally we face. I mean, these ones we continue to face, but there's additional there's additional complications. So normally we often, when we think of privacy, we think of privacy of data in our file systems, data when it is going over the communication link, and we know pretty well how to handle it using cryptography. And nowadays, using a combination of public key crypto and symmetric crypto, we can we don't need a prior relationship, a shared secret between the two parties. So the way modern crypto works is that both of us have certificates signed by some trusted authority, and we make use of what public key crypto to exchange some information. The end result of that phase is that both parties learn a shared secret. And then using that shared secret, we use the more efficient symmetric ciphers to then exchange the information. And this is how SSH works, and HTTPS and all, they are all kind of based upon that. So we know how to do it very well as long as you engineer it properly. Then there is one of privacy of identity. or anonymity. And this is the one which I was pointing out with the population scale stuff, where kind of the idea is that there are a whole bunch of sensors or data providers, and they're contributing some data to some sort of a publisher and aggregator, and then this publisher publishes some sort of a statistic or response to some query from some querier. Okay, so it could be a medical database with a researcher querying things like, I don't know, what fraction of people who had cancer also developed this disease, stuff like that. So those kind of queries. And this kind of work has advanced quite a bit also. So it used to be that the approach out here used to be that, in the data records, we will not put personal identification information. So we will not put name and things that are personally identifiable. But then some, whatever, 10, 15 years ago, there was a very famous attack in Massachusetts where a researcher at MIT or Harvard, I forget, showed that using supposedly anonymized databases, she was able to figure out some pretty private medical details about the governor of Massachusetts by linking across records. Okay, but then over the past 10 years or so, approach to this thing is emerged called differential privacy. And some of you may have heard this term because it's been in popular press also quite a bit, because companies like Apple say we use differential privacy. But differential privacy makes the following promise. It tells any one of these individuals that whether you choose to participate in this database or not, there is not going to be any additional loss of privacy. So like, for example, let's say there is a study about certain disease. I don't want anyone to know that I have that disease. So the decision I face is whether I participate in that database or not. But there is public information about me, right? I mean, type of job I do, city I live in, my ethnicity, age, stuff like that. And all these prior tell something about my chance of having that disease. So that is an irretrievable loss of privacy. And so the guarantee differential privacy makes is that beyond that, I will not have any additional loss of privacy. And the way it does is that whenever anyone asks the database query, the database adds sufficient noise to the response so that there will always be ambiguity. That is, the recipient cannot tell with confidence whether any given individual is in the database or not. Okay, so we just kind of perturb the response based upon that. And there is great theory which has developed around it. There are books and stuff like that. The person who did it, her name is Cynthia Dorr. She was at Microsoft Research, just became a professor at Harvard, but very nice piece of work. But it has, so it's nice because it's not making any assumption about what that other party knows. Okay, it can know anything in the world, whatever, makes no difference, because there's a very specific privacy promise being given, and that works. But even within this, there are lots of issues. Can you see a problem in this scenario? Who am I trusting? Hmm? Exactly, I'm still trusting the publisher, right? The aggregator. So there have been suggestions to deal with that also. One suggestion is that these guys add noise now, right? Before they send to the publisher. But unfortunately, that really messes up the quality of the Another challenge which comes is the following, that as you repeatedly answer queries, then very soon you lose your privacy budget. So there is a finite number of queries that you can answer, after which the privacy loss begins to happen. Then there are some other technicalities, like the whole theory is sort of, for you to get this kind of property, it becomes very hard if there is correlation across individuals. Okay, that is, data is correlated, that becomes a problem. So there are issues with this thing, but there is at least some robust literature out there. The setting often though that we have in this system, privacy of behavior, is one-on-one. I'm sharing data with Google Nest, they know me. So the challenge is not that I want to hide behind a crowd. There is no crowd to hide behind, but rather want to be selective about what the recipient can know or not know. So this is what I meant earlier by whitelist and blacklist, which is from the data that I'm sharing, I want, there are certain inferences that I'm okay the recipient to know, and there are others which I'm not okay the recipient to know. And when I say not okay and okay, what it means is that given whatever, that it should be feasible to, for some algorithm to derive these inferences, and it should not be feasible for any algorithm to derive these inferences. And the challenge is oftentimes these things are related. Let's say I want to reveal what I ate, but want to hide my religion. Yeah, I mean the two are obviously related in many instances, right? So that becomes, or I'm willing to share my location, but don't want to tell you whether I smoke. Well, if my location points to a smoking room, then there's a problem. So, so there's clearly kind of an overlap, but that's fundamentally what we are kind of after. So for example, common cases, medical studies on behavioral stress or something like that. I want to tell the researchers whenever I'm stressed, but I want to hide if I am using drugs, okay, because they kind of result in. Or I'm sharing stuff with the utility company, the smart meter data. I'm okay with them knowing demand response or doing billing and all, but I don't want them to know my specific activities, how much TV I'm watching, and stuff like that. So these are that's the challenge that you're going to face. So here you cannot hide behind a crowd. So the crowd approach, like I said, is the whole series of prior work, and then differential privacy is now kind of like the ruling solution. But like I said, there are issues, and there are sort of people continuing to work on better approaches still there also. But what you have in IoT devices often is this one-on-one kind of situation. You want to hide some behaviors and you want to reveal some behaviors. Um, uh, Going back out here, this issue that I don't want to trust the publisher also. So there are other ways around it also nowadays, which can make use of encryption kind of techniques, which allow you to send encrypted data so that you don't trust the aggregator, and yet you can let the aggregator compute a query. Okay, so that's kind of the model out there. So there are some stuff happening. So strategies that come very broadly, and as we'll see, kind of when we hit sort of specific papers from the course. So our goal is to share data from our phone or IoT devices at home or stuff like that. And so very broadly, two strategies. One is share answers, not data. Okay, to the as if at all possible, do the computation at the edge and share the result. So or share the compute the result within the part of the system that you trust. So it might be within the operating system, it might be within an encrypted bubble, but you have to do that. And oftentimes this means that we need to bring learning, inferencing, all those kind of things at close to the edge. And one of the drivers for creating chips which do machine learning and all on smartphones and IoT devices and all is indeed kind of privacy. That is, we'll never let the data, sort of sensitive data, kind of go out. And if you choose to do it in the cloud, then you should establish somehow a trust in that third party. And for that, also hardware solutions have begun to emerge, and they are called these just secure hardware enclaves, and we'll talk about it later in the course. And the second technique is selectively obfuscating the shared data. And I'm sort of using this term in a very generic sense, but what we do is we do something to that data, add noise, synthesize an equivalent data, censor it somehow, stuff like that. So obfuscate it so that we can exercise some control over what is being inferred and what is what can and what cannot be inferred. So that's sort of our goal. So the idea is that some sort of a firewall, but which is operating at a semantic level, which is operating at the level of what can be inferred. So these are two parts of the solution, really. I think much of the work out there, you can kind of bin it into this category, that do things at the edge, raise the currency at which you are exchanging information, no longer measurements, if possible, send answers. And the other one is kind of mess with the data so that you can exercise some control over before it goes out. But you have to be very careful about it, because anytime you mess with the data, you're also affecting the quality with which the desired result is being affected. So there's a balance that you have to strike. So just to give you an example of work, this is, we were engaged in it, but it's mostly work of my collaborators at another university. So what we are doing here is the following. We conduct medical studies where we ask subjects to wear a variety of sensors, chest belts, smart watches, stuff like that. And then we collect data about respiration, ECG, accelerometer data for motion, stuff like that. A whole bunch of things we can infer from smart watches. We can infer when you are eating, smoking, drinking, stuff like that. There's a variety of stuff that can happen. And some of those things are okay, whitelisted. Some of those things we don't want people to know, like we don't even want the researchers to know. So while when we conduct these medical studies, it is under under a lot of uh, contracts that we sign. So like we give the subjects kind of saying we will do this with the data and we will do that with the data and stuff like that, and they eventually trust us, okay, because they have no other choice, or they refuse to participate in the study. But at the same time, this data can be misused. There are few different scenarios. One is the researcher, him or herself, is not very ethical, let's say. That happens. Another possibility is that we are sloppy about keeping control over the data, so we might put it on a computer and discard it, or the computer is easily accessible over the network. And the third is this data is often redistributed to other researchers, and they may not be that ethical about it. So, so a variety of these things kind of happen. So this system called MSIEV, what it does is it seeks to make a promise that the data that you will release after sanitization or obfuscation um, will be such that you will not be able to distinguish uh, the, the quality with which, the probability with which you can infer the blacklisted inference, and the probability with which you can infer it from the original data, they are indistinguishable. That's basically what we try to achieve. Um, this this kind of way of looking at indistinguishability is kind of similar to differential privacy, where we say whether you take part in this study or not makes no difference. Okay, there's no additional loss of privacy that is kind of going on. So the way MSIEV works is, what it does is, it's kind of a, honestly, kind of a hackish approach, but that's the state of the field in this thing. What it does is, it looks for portions in the time series where blacklisted events occur. And then it removes those, so censors it, but instead of just sending nothing there, because that would be a giveaway that something blacklisted happened. So what it does is it substitutes some trace from elsewhere from the same person out there, okay? Um, and it blends the ends and then kind of releases that. What weakness do you see in that? So again, it sort of removes the blacklisted one, takes something from elsewhere, takes it in.
It might not make any sense. Like if you put it in an activity that's not supposed to be there.
Okay, so it may violate some higher level expectation, right? I mean, for example, maybe as a result of it, it shows that I'm never going to a restaurant, which will be hard to believe. Okay, so
you can still alter like the whitelisted inferences.
You could still what?
Alter the whitelisted inferences.
You could alter the whitelisted inferences, although I guess what it does is that it only takes the areas where nothing was happening, neither whitelist law. But you're still right that there may be some other inference which is neither in whitelist or blacklist whose frequency or statistics are getting affected, and that may be a giveaway. There's a more obvious one, right? I mean, I'm taking segments from elsewhere, so we can do a brute force search and look for similarity. Right? I mean, so that's another weakness. So that there are plenty of issues out there. But one thing which this brings out is that censoring is not easy, okay? Because if you just delete something, that tells you you must have something to hide. So in many cases, uh, you have to make sure that the new time series is not only one which is saying you did not sanitize. So it has to pass kind of some sort of a plausibility argument that this new trace is also a plausible trace and not one where that is implausible. And also certainly I should not be able to identify specific instances because then I know something must have happened. Now the other option out here is that not only do I remove blacklist, but also other parts of the waveform to create confusion. So just for example, if I want to, if I censor by replacing it with saying, oh, loss happened out here. But if I only do it at times when blacklist was happening, then it's a dead giveaway. But if my scheme is that I will always do the blacklist, and then I will also remove it at other times, now you're confused. Or in fact, another strategy possibly is that I may not do all the blacklist, or maybe I may shift the blacklist, right? I mean, there are all these kind of things. So part of it is depends what the goal is. If I create sufficient ambiguity that you cannot use the end result to convict me of wrongdoing, maybe that's the threshold. But a different threshold is that I don't want to be embarrassed that that you can accuse me of doing something which is shameful. So there could be different objectives, and they require some different some care about it. So censoring, substitution, and another strategy is the synthesis. So this is the project idea that I was mentioning, that building upon this work. So this is Mustafa's work, and he used adversarial training. In this particular case, there's nothing about privacy. All I'm showing is that we can generate sensor signals. So therefore, that's a possible pathway. So what you see out here is kind of a multi-layer network. And what you see is true accelerometer and a synthesized accelerometer. True ECG, synthesized ECG. So it is possible to kind of generate or synthesized realistic looking signals. And I think a good early work in this kind of technology is music synthesis. A lot of work in 80s and 90s on synthesizing music, and some of the approaches were there were sample clips, and you'll take those sample clips and stitch them together into a particular piece, and then started coming things which were more sophisticated. That is, they would algorithmically synthesize. And recently, deep networks have begun to do very well when it comes to synthesis of images, video, and speech, including perhaps you may have seen these clips last year where Obama is giving a speech which he never gave, or stuff like that, which have been floating around. So, or like generating faces of celebrities or whatever celebrity-like faces. This was NVIDIA work. So, ability to synthesize complicated things have advanced considerably. Much of the attention has focused on images, and for the most part, but I think same ideas could work in here as well. Some challenges that one, or problem areas: respect for second and third parties. That is, what happens when my sensor is picking up your signals, or when you are coming to my space, right? I mean, so a variety of scenarios. We are both in public space, we're kind of picking up, or you're coming to my home and my sensors pick up whose right it is, what can we design these systems so that they are somewhat respectful. The project idea we have about the local laws and all is influenced by this, because whether I can record or not is dictated by the local conditions also. So those kind of things come up. In some settings, you have another problem also, which is privacy of the sensors themselves. So thus far, we have been talking about privacy of the sensed object, but in many cases, the sensors themselves need to be privacy aware. Can you think of some examples? where sensors, I mean, this slide is saying privacy of sensors in terms of location. A sensor may not want to share its location. So that could simply be if I'm submitting a report, like the Waze kind of example, right? I mean, that's one. I want to help out Waze with the city level traffic estimate, but I don't want to want my location to be known. Yeah, other examples of a similar flavor, like I mean, people who are reporting things about crime and all to authorities, they may not want to reveal it, kind of like the whistleblower kind of a setting, those kind of things. So location obviously tends to be a very common one that you don't want to get known. But there are other ones also. I want to help track the spread of flu, but I don't want specific individuals to know that I have flu, right? I mean, it might be information like that that will be after. So, so that's kind of a twist on the privacy problem, that the privacy of the sensors themselves. And sometimes it requires reformulating the algorithms and making use of encryption so that you can hide it. We'll talk about this work later in the course, but basically, this is what this work attempts to do. So common way to localize, so let's say I have a bunch of people who are going to help localize some event. I gave that example of the Caltech earthquake system, right? I mean, what it does is it measures the whatever the shaking, and then helps Caltech localize the strength and location epicenter of the earthquake. There are similar other systems. U.S. Army has often used these systems where in whatever in their urban warfare setting, people would have smartphones which will be on the lookout for loud noises, blast and whatever firing events, and then stitching them together, they would localize where the event happened so that they can respond to that. So in each one of these cases, you need that there is a sensor observation, but you also need sensors location, because then you do a triangulation or multilateration or something like that. So you need, sensor needs to provide its location in addition to providing either a range or a direction or both kind of an estimate. So the question is, could we do this thing without the sensors revealing their location? Okay. So could I do multilateration or triangulation, those kind of things, without that? So what this work by my student Amr and a former student Yasser, what these guys do is the following, that they kind of reformulate the underlying optimization problem, and essentially what happens is the following, that instead of sharing uh, the range and its own location, what this thing does is it shares a particular data structure, which is kind of a polygonal sample of a circle, together with a parameter which tells about where the circle is located, kind of the center of the circle, but that is encrypted. So center of the circle tells where the location is, but that is encrypted. And then instead of a circle, they send this kind of a polygonal curve. Long story short, it turns out that with this kind of structure, you can do a particular type of encryption so that you can compute over the encrypted data. That is, I can compute f of x where x is encrypted, okay? And we can do it very efficiently, and that's what kind of the systems makes use of. So in the closing minutes, some other points that I wanted to make. So when we design systems, a very valuable principle to remember is this principle of least privilege. I had it in an earlier slide also, but just wanted to bring that out again, that an app, a user, a service must be able to access only the information that is necessary for legitimate purposes. So no excessive information release, because generally speaking, this will lead to a system which is more secure and more privacy. So I examples where kind of goes to that thing of share answers, not data, right? I mean, goes in that sense. But oftentimes there are system level hurdles on it. You may not be able to do the computation, and there are temptation for getting data from your source so that you can use it for other purposes. Protect information with encryption. No excuse not to. And in next lecture, we will see plenty of examples of systems which even now are being built, medical devices and all, where either the encryption is absent or is laughably poor. At this stage, if the data is at rest or in motion, we know how to do this thing pretty well, barring obviously software engineering type mistakes. There is, though, a problem that the encryption that we currently do is often not very flexible. That is, if I want a computation to be done on the data, then generally speaking, I need to reveal X to that party. Only then the computation can be done. So I can transmit X over an encrypted channel, but then I need to give the recipient a key so that he can decrypt and do the computation on X. But even that has begun to change. So even though currently decryption is all or nothing, even in our differential privacy type situation where there is a publisher, I I have a challenge that I have to trust this. But a setting often is I want to publish data to a publisher, and I have different clients, researcher, family, and I want them to know different functions of X. So could we design a system so that I can put out my encrypted sensor data onto some sort of a web service, and I don't reveal the key to the publisher, and then I give the researcher a key so that when he accesses the encrypted data, he can get f of x. I give my family a different key, and they access and they get some different data, and so on and so forth. That's the goal that we want, and so currently the approach is that the only way we can do this thing is that we have to tell the publisher the key so that the f of x can be computed, and that's not very satisfactory. But new methods are emerging which, like I said, help us do that. So one, let's see, yeah. So one approach is this whole, kind of just do computation encryption. So one approach is this notion of homomorphic encryption. And homomorphic encryption basically says that encryption and computation are commutative. So I can do encryption first and then computation, or vice versa. It makes no difference. There's a particular type of encryption that one could do. So, and it turns out in particular, there is a form of homomorphic encryption, which is for limited type of computation, but which is very efficient. So generally speaking, there's this thing called fully homomorphic encryption, whose feasibility became known in like 2010 or so, and basically says an arbitrary algorithm, we now know in principle how to send you encrypted data, and then you can run your algorithm on the encrypted data and get the result.
Does the function you do have to be deterministic?
It can be any computation it can express. There are some technical issues about ability to deal with floating point numbers and all, but those are minor one. The bigger one is it's many orders of magnitude too slow. Okay, so like started out like 9 or 10 order of magnitude too slow. I think right now it's more like 5 order of magnitude too slow. So essentially, unless the computation is very small, it's not very feasible. Just to give you an example, the trilateration computation that I was showing that in the localization example, if we were to do it using fully homomorphic, each localization operation on a pretty fast computer takes us around 45 to 50 minutes. Whereas natively it is sub 1 second. Okay, so huge differences. But partially homomorphic says that as long as your computation is such that, let's see, one of the two operators, addition or multiplication, is homomorphic and the other is not. Okay, so essentially, if I can express my computation so that it has addition and multiplications by constants, a constant and a variable, but I am not allowed to have multiplications of two variables, or if I do, they have to be done in the open, then I can work. And guess what? All linear time invariant systems are like that. So a lot of machine learning and those kind of algorithms fit into that category. So we can do partially homomorphic stuff very efficiently now. So a lot of image processing, linear classifiers, naive Bayes, decision tree, SVM, a lot of the machine learning thing, and even neural networks. While the neurons have this nonlinearity, but you can have types of nonlinearity which fit into this framework, so you can even do those. So there are pretty efficient libraries and all at this stage if you want to do partially homomorphic thing. It is still slower, and I guess a penalty that you pay out here is that your data size is bigger. So once you encrypt, the data size bloats up. So you do give up on the efficiency side on that front. But what you get in return is encrypted data over which all those computations can still be done. So I'm going to wrap this thing up on Thursday and then move on to the next topic. Okay. So and come and start talking to me about the projects. See ya.